Really happy to have Pranab Bardhan here to join us today. So I didn't know if you would remember, but you did remember that I took your class in international trade 22 years ago when I started at Berkeley, and I took his class in my second year. I'm not sure if he knew that I didn't finish that class, because I very quickly learned that I was not very interested in international trade, nor did I have a particular skill for international trade, and I quickly fled into a mix of applied microeconomics and labor and development and political economy. And had Pranab taught a political economy class, I might have gone in a very different career trajectory, because his work still ends up being extremely influential to what I do. And indeed, I was just telling him I have a class called How to Change the World, which is the social science of policymaking, where two of his papers feature on the syllabus. And I got introduced to that too late to take his classes, and so I'm a little regretful about that. But I do maintain that international trade, of the many, many, many things that Pranab works on, with his more than 45,000 citations on Google Scholar and 150 articles, and if we only count the books that he wrote and not edited, we're only at about 17. And so the span is great. It's just an enormous number of topics, and I recommend all of them, perhaps, and I'm sure there's something interesting in international trade on there as well. But I'd say the work on corruption and rethinking corruption and challenging the way we think about corruption, on decentralization, on state capacity, have transformed how I understand the subject. I encourage you to go read his work, because one of the other features of Pranab is not only does he write dense technical economics papers, and not only does he write a very chatty, accessible memoir, which I'll get to in a moment, but he's just written an enormous number of very accessible, very cogent review articles, not just in the Journal of Economic Perspectives and the Journal of Economic Literature, but many others. And these have just been like a tremendous resource to generations of economists and political scientists and everyone else. And so go out and read them, because I think they're some of the best. And they, to the extent that I've written some of these myself, I think your style and approach has always been a big inspiration. I really recommend the book. Some of you will have gotten a complimentary copy. If not, I recommend grabbing one anyways. As a memoir, as an insight into a really historic and idiosyncratic 60-year career. It's very engaging. It's often entertaining. It's often jaw-dropping. But to me, I think maybe the lesson that I drew from it, something I've tried to emulate myself, but I realize I could do better, is how I feel like every 4 or 5 or 6 years, Pranab has transformed what he works on and gone into a new area of economics where perhaps he had not tread before, and perhaps very few had tread before, and then he goes and he immerses himself in it and occasionally revolutionizes it. And I think that's where the intellectual richness, and that's the best part of this job, is that we can do this. And I've tried to do it myself once or twice. And I'm actually 8 years now working on a new topic, which means I'm probably due, if I'm going to emulate this example, to mix it up and shift continents or shift topics once again. With that, I'm going to get out of your way. I'm going to hand it over to Pranab. Pranab's going to speak for about 25 minutes, talking about his book, giving a reading, and then I'll open it up with a few questions before we open it up to all of you. Thank you very much. Pranab.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that overgenerous comments, and thank this institution, everybody involved in organizing this, for making this possible. It's a great opportunity for me to meet you. What I'm going to do, by the way, Chris, I think we agreed on 45, not 25 minutes. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start with some general remarks and then read up some passages which are more like anecdotes. This is one of the 2 products of COVID. During those 2 years that, like many of you, I was in house arrest, I wrote 2 books. One came out last year, Harvard University Press published it. It's called Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. If you're interested in that topic, it's again written for a general readership. You can pick it up. It's a Harvard University Press book. The other book is this one, Charaiveti. Charaiveti is a memoir. Oh, by the way, it's probably written in one of those notes that you have. Charaiveti is a word belonging to an ancient Sanskrit hymn, which I think was composed sometime between 5th and 6th century BCE. I've been told that after about 2-3 centuries later, Gautama Buddha, at the end of his sermons, every day, he used to chant Charaiveti, Charaiveti. It means, in the original Sanskrit hymn, it means keep moving in search of self-realization. Writing a memoir, in fact, as soon as I started writing a memoir, is always a matter of conceit, because you always think, why would others be interested in your life? So writing a memoir is a bit of a conceit. But then I tell myself, because it's not mainly about myself, it's about others. The whole book is full of observations on politics, on society, on culture, and of course, economics, and economists. The anecdotes are mostly about economists, many of them. And of course, my life being in the background, it lends some intimacy to those observations. But those observations are much more of the general about society. Which society? Well, mainly about 2 countries, country that I come from, India, and the country where I live, United States, but also some other countries I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with large parts of Western Europe, so there's quite a bit of that, particularly Britain, where I went as a student, Cambridge, England, where I was a student, and then many times, over many decades, I've been visiting fellows at Oxford and Cambridge colleges and a visiting professor at London School of Economics several times. So there's a whole chapter on the English academic life. And there are a lot of funny stories about it, relating to English academic life. But also, I would say not all funny. There are some serious observations also. Another country I've visited many times is China. There's a whole chapter on China. And my abiding interest in China. So it's not just India and the US, but some other countries as well. The book, of course, captures many of my preoccupations in economics. Some of these have to with big questions, comparative economic systems-wise. For example, there are a lot of observations in the book in different parts about capitalism, socialism, democracy, which happens to be the title of Joseph Schumpeter's book. Also about nationalism, democracy, capital, socialism, and democracy, and nationalism. But also about, in different parts, scattered comments on what I would call social coordination mechanisms. 3 major social coordination mechanisms. The market is a superb coordination mechanism. It has a lot of problems. Superb coordination mechanism, social coordination mechanism. The state is another one. And at the local level, the community. And the interactions of these 3. that I'm perpetually interested in, and there will be scattered comments in the book. In fact, in my democracy book, I go over these also, these state, community, and market, the interactions of them. They have great advantages. They also have big failures. We all know about market failures, government failures, and community failures. So I talk about that in that book in great detail, in this book also. In economics, three issues have been of my abiding, as Chris mentioned that I moved from one field to another, but three issues have been an abiding interest in economics. One, only later, after doing research for many years in that area, later I realized this is institutional economics. At those times, it was not called institutional economics. Just to tell you how ancient I am, my first article in development economics came out in American Economic Review in 1971. What was it on? On an age-old agrarian institution of sharecropping. But it was an institution. And then, not just myself, quite a few of us were doing both theoretical and empirical work, micro-empirical work quite often, on agrarian institutions of various kinds. Sharecropping is in the land market, in labor market institutions, credit market institutions, etc. Now, we are doing it in 1970s and 1980s. Now, if you count 71 as my first sharecropping article, I think the rest of economics started doing institutional economics only in the 1990s. Empirically, beginning is mostly cross-country statistical regressions. That's middle 90s. But we were doing, many of us, not just myself, quite a few of us were doing micro-institutional economics that, in that sense, 25 years back. But this has been an abiding interest. And this has also been part of my many village surveys that I carried out, and I talk about that. And in that connection, the kind of village survey work that I was doing borders on economic anthropology. And I talk about the strengths and weaknesses of these two subjects related to this same subject of village, economy and society. My village surveys, by the way, was in the end of 1970s and 1980, first half of 1980s. I went back to the same villages many times. We had a random sample for the state of West Bengal, where I'm from, a random sample of about 110 villages. And we went back again and again and focusing on relations, what Marx would call relations of production, which economists call institutions. And then at a later stage, that was done along with a statistician friend of mine, Indian statistician friend of mine. And more recent years, I've gone back to villages again, but a different set of sample, about 90 villages, and that I did with Dilip Mukherjee, this time focusing on governance issues. That's also an institution, but governance issues like decentralization. So institutional economics is one. Second abiding interest was what economists were interested only very recently. Political scientists have been interested in for a long time, what is called collective action. I grew up in a very, very poor neighborhood. And in that neighborhood, I saw that everybody was aware there are a lot of problems. They knew what the problems were. They also knew quite often what the solutions were. But they were not done. Or another way of saying it, they couldn't get their act together. And getting your act together is a simple way of saying what we call collective action, problems of collective action. So I was doing collective action issues. I did macro stuff, like why it is difficult for India to do collective action on a macroeconomic front, because India is extremely heterogeneous, extremely diverse, and unequal. And a lot of my theoretical work was about why inequality makes collective action difficult. In fact, I have a book called Scarcity, Conflicts, and Cooperation, MIT Press, where a lot of it is on collective action and conflicts, and why inequality makes things difficult. Both I have a theoretical model as well as some empirical work. When I was working on local commons, essentially local environmental resources like water, I did mostly on irrigation water, like forestry, fishery. I did some work on forestry, fishery, and I have a theoretical paper on fisheries, and grazing lands. These are local commons, and I was working on them. At that time, hardly any economist was interested in this. I remember around 1993, when I was in the editorial board of Journal of Economic Perspectives, and my friend Joe Stiglitz was the editor. Joe said, why didn't you organize some, since you are interested in different issues, why didn't you organize some symposia? And one symposium I remember organizing was on management of local commons, collective action problems in local commons. And I invited somebody who economists have never heard of at that time, Elinor Ostrom, who later was to get the Nobel Prize. Even when she got the Nobel Prize, most economists say, who's she? So that is the extent of economists' interest in that subject. Elinor, I used to call her Lynn. Lynn wrote a book called Governing the Commons, mostly about in rich countries, but also some in poor countries. So Lynn told me once, you are a weird economist. Nobody else is interested in the local commons, and you are. I said, that's the rural livelihood of the rural poor, largely based on daily life, depends on those local environmental resources. Third, so institutional economics, collective action. Third, by the way, one economist whom I became very friendly with, who was interested in collective action, was Mansur Olson. But Mansur was primarily interested in political collective action, like why is it the United States pays the large bill of NATO? That's the kind of collective action problem that Mansur was primarily interested in. The third issue, which I've already referred to, the abiding interest throughout my professional life, was inequality. And even interrelation between inequality and collective action. Why inequality makes collective action difficult sometimes. And in fact, around middle 90s, I became the co-director of a Chicago MacArthur Foundation group on inequality. Our focus is on costs of inequality, the bad consequences of inequality. And that group, we had about 18 people. It's an international group, 18 people. Some of those members of that group are now quite famous. You've heard about my friend Thomas Piketty, who's now become a rock star in the field of inequality. And also 3 other economists got the Nobel Prize, Michael Kremer here, and Esther Duflo, and Abhijit Banerjee. So they're all in the same group, but we also some sociologists, historians, anthropologists, and so on in that group. I enjoyed the company of this group. We went on for about 10 years, from 1995 to 2005, roughly, a little more than 10 years. And a lot of research was done in that group, and I really, really learned a great deal from that group. Let me mention just 2 other things, general observations, and then I'll go to anecdotes. First, I had two major turns in my professional life, and both of them relate to the first university I taught in this country, which is MIT. And professional turn was, in some sense, is that I was never thinking of coming to the United States. I was doing my PhD in Cambridge, England. James Mead, the international trade economist, was my supervisor, but the person who really, really helped me a great deal in Cambridge was James Merlis. He and I were good friends, and he helped me a great deal in my dissertation. But as luck would have it, the last year of my dissertation, two great American economists visited Cambridge for the whole year. One is someone I regard as one of the greatest economists of all times, is Kenneth Arrow. And the other is Robert Solow. Now, those days I was primarily working on growth theory with some application to international trade. And since both Arrow and Solow were working on growth theory, they became interested in my dissertation. Both of them read my dissertation. And in fact, Arrow said, a lot of people in the US are working on this area, but you have got far more advanced in this area. Immediately publish them. So I published many of the articles in the top 5 journals before I submitted my dissertation. But Solow gave me a lot of comments on each chapter, and I got to know Robert Solow quite well. The end of that year, and I was finishing my dissertation, going back to my teaching job in India, Solow one day saw me and said, "Would you like to join the faculty at MIT?" Now, I was completely taken aback. Not merely I didn't apply for it, but I've never even imagined going to the United States. And I should be honest and say at that time, the United States did not have a good image in my mind. The Vietnam War was going on. So I never thought of coming to the United States at that time. My friends told me, "You are silly." Solow said, "Join the faculty at MIT." You said, "Give me some time to think about it," and so on. I didn't apply, nothing. I didn't know anybody else in MIT. So I took 2 months' time and finally decided, I told Robert that I will join. So that was a big turning point in my professional life. Second turning point also, I came to MIT, I taught for about 3 years or so, and then I decided to go back to India. Why? Because at that time, MIT it's a dynamo of activity, and I became very productive. I published many journal articles, mostly on growth theory, many on international trade theory, and so on. I was doing mainly theoretical work at that time. I remember at Jim Marlis's encouragement, I used to take courses in Cambridge on nonlinear differential equations, optimal control theory, things like that. But in my 3 years in MIT, something was gnawing at me. This is not what I want to do. I want to dirty my hands with real-world data and about India. But at that time, the only Indian data that you can get is from IMF reports for the whole macroeconomy, national income, monetary policy, fiscal policy, etc. But that's not what I want to do, work with. And nowhere you could get data. So I decided to go back to India. I remember telling the chairman of the department at MIT that I've decided to go back to India. He said, "Nobody leaves MIT voluntarily." Then I told him, what I told him amounted to, in today's terms, when lovers break up, they say, "It's not you, it's me." So that's essentially what I told him, it's me. The problem is with me. So I went back. Before going, by the way, I consulted someone who had been a mentor in my academic life, is Amartya Sen. So I asked him, "This is what I've decided. he did not discourage me, but he did tell me something. He said, are you aware how much of an academic gamble you are taking? You're going to India and collecting village data and all that, and you are giving a signal to the rest of the profession that you are retreating from the frontier of the subject. Which was true, because development economics was completely marginalized at that time. And what if development economics existed at that time, one was like Arthur Lewis type structural transformation, or economic relation between rich countries and poor countries. The leftists were working on dependencia theory. Others were working on terms of trade between balance of payments problems between rich and poor countries. Nobody worked on the micro development field. And in the beginning, really, after a lot of work, you write an article, submit it to a top journal. Believe me, next day they will send it back. It was hard to get refereed. And the usual cover letter of the editors were, this article uses Indian data, send it to an Indian journal. They will not even consider it, not refereed. In the initial submissions, they will not get refereed. But I persevered, because I've already been in that world. I published in the top journals, but mostly theoretical work. So I kept on pursuing. Finally, that's the American Economic Review articles, sharecropping and so on. And I finally succeeded, but it was like breaking a glass ceiling. Esther even now tells me, you broke the ground for us. But it was hard at that time. It was largely because development economics is completely marginalized. And that's what Amartya Sen meant. They were taking a big gamble. By the way, I should also tell you, even if forgetting about this concrete problem, submit an article in American Economic Review, the submission fee was 1/3 of my monthly salary as a professor in Delhi. So I wrote once to the American Executive Council of the American Economic Association, could you lower the fee for the people resident in developing countries? It's very interesting. I got an answer. It was discussed in the executive committee's meeting, and they rejected my proposal and gave me reasons. They said, have you considered that if you publish an article in American Economic Review, it's going to raise the expected lifetime income of yours. So why should you not pay for it yourself? I thought, when I got that letter, I thought of giving it to my undergraduate students as a problem set. I said, find what is wrong with this argument. Anyway, so let me now go to anecdotes. By the way, this book has anecdotes not just about economics and economists, a lot about literature, a lot of cinema. Cinema is one of my many passions. It's a lot of stories about, but I'm not going to talk about cinema today. So, some anecdotes. So let me, MIT, when I went to MIT, of course, the main person there at that time was Paul Samuelson, who one day told me, hey, Samuelson had this habit of every semester he would teach a different field. So one semester he said, next semester I want to teach international economics with you. So I did teach an international economics course with Paul. Problem is that he always took class at 8 a.m., which is when I hardly wake up. But Samuelson was, of course, I have lots of anecdotes about Samuelson here in the book, but I'll just read one of them. So Paul Samuelson, every day at noon, would preside over the lunch table at the MIT Faculty Club in the top floor of the building. At the table, he would often entertain us, drawing upon his spectacular collection of stories and gossip, not just about economists, but often about physicists and mathematicians. To Paul, there was a clear hierarchy of disciplines. It was visibly demonstrated to me one day when we took a visiting English friend who wanted to meet Paul. We told Paul that he would be interested to know that this friend had done his degree in astrophysics, but now he was thinking of moving to economics. At this, and this I cannot forget, Paul immediately said, astrophysics, economics at his chest level. What next? Theology, it's hand at the knee level. So that's his hierarchy of subjects. And then I say, I have great respect for Paul's many fundamental contributions, both to shaping the methods and tools of economics and to its substantive content. Yet, I have sometimes felt that he has pushed the subject more toward the application of physics and classical mechanics and equilibrium systems than yet it may have been completely healthy for the subject. At the lunch table, whenever the names of two stalwart economists of his generation came up, Paul would never miss an opportunity to take good-natured potshots at them. One was politically to his right, Milton Friedman, and the other to his left, John Kenneth Galbraith at Harvard. Having talked about Friedman, and we are in the Becker-Friedman Institute, so let me tell you about my only encounter with Milton Friedman. Toward the end of 1980s, I was invited, I think it was a development conference. I was invited as a plenary speaker, and so was Milton Friedman was another plenary speaker. So during his plenary speech, by the way, end of 1980s, you remember, 1980s was when Japan was the country, wildly successful all over. So Milton, when he, in his speech, said, and I was praising Japan a lot, and he was attributing Japan's success to free markets. And then to contrast it, he said, look at India. India's done so poorly because of controls, regulations, which is true. But that's not the only reason why India's done poorly. But controls, regulations did hurt India. But I raised my hand and I said, Professor Friedman, you praise Japan as a case of free market. Japan is not exactly a paragon of non-intervention. It's a very active, strong state, quite a regulatory state in many ways. You know, to this day, I'll not forget his answer. He said, oh, yes, but if Japan were less interventionist, Japan would have done even better. Which to me was a kind of cop-out, but that was my encounter with Milton Friedman. My next story is somebody who later was the president of Harvard, Larry Summers. But my incident is when Larry was a vice president of the World Bank. Around the beginning of 1990s, I was invited to give a keynote talk at the Pakistani Institute of Development Economics at Islamabad. And on the day of my lecture, they told me that Larry Summers, then the vice president of the World Bank, was in town, and so they had invited him to be my discussant at the lecture. I immediately know that Larry would be very critical because my talk, those are the days of Washington Consensus, and my talk was about pitfalls of privatization. That was my topic. After my lecture, when Larry rose to speak, he said, and I quote, I'm going to be critical of Professor Bardhan for several reasons, one of them being personal. Personal? He may not remember. When I was a student in his class at MIT, he gave me the only B+ grade in my whole life. When it came to my turn to reply to his criticisms, I said, and I quote, I don't remember giving him a B+ at MIT, but today, after listening to him, I can tell you that he has improved a little. His grade now is A minus. And then I proceeded to explain why it is not an A. The Pakistani audience seemed to lap it up, particularly because until then, everybody was deferential to Larry. Later, when I asked Stan Fisher, who one time was a Chicago faculty, but who was an MIT student, Stan was one of my students at MIT. I asked Stan, was Larry really my student? Then Stan told me, no, I think he probably was an undergraduate student at MIT, and undergraduate classes being large, that's the reason I don't remember him. My next anecdotes are from India, but it has a Chicago connection. The first time I came to Chicago, just after joining MIT, those days one stalwart in international trade theory was Harry Johnson, who used to be a professor at Chicago. So Harry invited me to give a talk in his seminar, international trade seminar. So after the talk, Harry said, we are going to take you out to dinner, but it so happens that University of Chicago is giving a gala dinner to an Indian professor. Would you like to join that? I said, which is that professor? He said, Professor P.C. Mahalanobis. Many of you may not know him, but he played a very important role both in Indian statistics and Indian planning. So I said, sure, I've never met him. I'd like to meet him. So I went to the dinner. Harry then so arranged, they put me next to Mahalanobis. Mahalanobis was entertaining. He was recently back from China, so entertaining the whole dinner table about his talks with Zhou Enlai, who at that time was the premier in China. So when Harry sat me next to him, I told him in Bengali, because that's my language, is also his language. I said, I didn't think that I would have the good fortune to meet you here in Chicago. He didn't say anything. He went back to his Zhou Enlai stories. And then after some time, he turned to me. You said you had good fortune to meet me? Do you want a job in ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, which he was the director of? I said, no, I have a good job at MIT. I don't want to join. But it so happened I later did join ISI, Indian Statistical Institute. So let me tell you a couple of stories about Mahalanobis. He was a big role in Indian planning and Indian statistics, as I told you. He was the director and the founder director of the Indian Statistical Institute. At that time, Indian Statistical Institute is one of the major statistics institutes in the whole world. I should have also told you that after that dinner, he said, come along with me. I said, where? So he took me to meet a great astrophysicist in Chicago, later got the Nobel Prize, Chandrasekhar, S. Chandrasekhar. So I went to his home. He introduced me to Chandrasekhar. Anyway, so Mahalanobis was a great institution, but he was very stern. And I'm going to tell you a story about his sternness. Those days at ISI, the Indian Statistical Institute, most people there had an office space, only a cubicle, with adjustable wooden partitions. I've heard that Mahalanobis used to express his satisfaction or dissatisfaction with your work by adjusting those partitions overnight. In the morning, if you arrived to find your cubicle had shrunk, you understood that the director was unhappy with your work. Labor economists should note this way of expressing your work. Of course, one great thing is he's not merely got many great statisticians to visit of the world, visit ISI, many scientists and economists to visit ISI. One of the distinguished people who came to ISI and stayed on and became an Indian citizen was J.B.S. Haldane, possibly the 20th century's most accomplished biologist. I remember when I was a student in Kolkata, I used to go to the ISI library because they had good journals. I used to see this large Englishman in Indian tunic with a fat unlit cigar in his hand, reading Biometrica. I now wish I had the courage to go and talk to this formidable-looking man. Later, I read a lot about his eccentric personality. As a Marxist, he once claimed that reading Lenin cured his gastritis. He said political dissent led him to leave England for India. But another reason was that he would not have to wear socks. 60 years of socks is enough, he said. He often experimented on himself. In one of his self-experiments, he suffered perforated eardrums. He later said, and I quote, "The drum generally heals up, and if a hole remains in it, although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of that ear," which he thought was a great social accomplishment. My next thing that I want to tell you is about the intellectual milieu in Delhi. I had a lot of stories about problems with data in Delhi, but that was official data. Later, then I started collecting my own data. But the Delhi milieu is something that I think is common to many other countries, but I just want to tell you the Indian intellectual milieu at that time. Usually people often classify particularly social scientists and others too, as left and right. And I very soon realized that is the wrong division, at least in the Indian social context. The bigger divide was how do you relate to state versus society? Going back to the 3 social coordination mechanisms that I talked. So I found out, for example, a whole bunch of mainly economists, but also historians and others. They were leftists, but their primary occupation was looking at the state. Whenever there is a problem, economists, when they have a problem, market failure or unfairness, you turn to the state. And there is another type of social scientists, not that many economists. I used to attend their groups, but not that many economists. I actually described the salon life of Delhi. So there's some salons which are mainly bureaucrats, economists, policymakers, and so on. Not all left, but they are all for the state. The state is what will solve the problem. And the other group at salon I used to go to are mostly about the sociologists, anthropologists, etc. And I had and largely it was salon of my good friend, social psychologist, Ashish Nandi. And he and I used to debate a lot on these issues. And I very soon realized this is a reflection of a debate that was going on earlier during the freedom struggle and shortly after in India. So for great leaders. So for example, Mahatma Gandhi or Rabindranath Tagore, the poet, they were emphasizing society and community. Whereas Jawaharlal Nehru, and one of the founders of the Indian Constitution, Ambedkar, lawyer, economist, their solution problem is state. In fact, there's a lot of, Ambedkar openly says that the village is just a den of ignorance and communalism and superstitions. And the way to end this oppression is turning to the state. And he wrote the Constitution with that in mind. So this state-centric versus society-centric, to me, was a much bigger divide among social scientists and others than left-right. Since my time is 5 minutes, but quickly, I will tell you a story about, I'm just trying to decide. Okay, one story about Paris, and the other story is a general one. So, whenever I go to Paris, one attractive thing of this lovely city was that you could walk from the main part of Paris. I used to love walking. French have a term for it. It's called flânerie, flaneur. Charles Baudelaire was a great flaneur. Recently I discovered Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his last book is on reveries of walking, I forget the title, walking around Paris. So flânerie. So I'm a flaneur. I walk these streets. In fact, and aimlessly. And once so aimlessly, a plainclothes policeman came, thought I'm an illegal immigrant. So he asked for my passport, etc. But anyway, so my friend, the French economist, François Bourguignon. François said, okay, I know you go for walks. Then at the end of your walk, in the evening, let's meet in a restaurant, a very old restaurant I want to take you to. So when I arrived there, it was a very old cafe restaurant. And so as soon as I entered, François took me and made me sit in a particular place. And then after I got seated, he said, this is where, in the 19th century, Balzac used to sit every evening. And then I go into a lot of Balzac stories, how great an eater he was, and so on. But I'll skip that. So during our dinner, Francois said, you know, in Paris, economists are low status. If you are a poet or a writer, your status is much higher. I said, you wouldn't believe it, Francois. I come from a city where it's exactly the same. And then I told him a story, which is what I'm going to read. This is a story about an incident in my life. Once, a well-known Bengali writer, poet friend of mine, the Bengalis here would know his name, Sunil Ganguly, and I were walking in a Kolkata street where every few minutes he would be surrounded by young women asking for his autograph. These are days before selfie. While obliging them, he saw me waiting at a distance with a bored look and told these women that I too apparently was a well-known person. At this, a couple of women came toward me and asked me what I did. As soon as I said I was an economist, they turned around and rejoined the crowd around Sunil. This put me and my discipline in our place. The last thing that I'm going to read, given my time, is the last chapter of the book is titled At Journey's End. And Journey's End, I in fact referred to Journey's End. There's a lot of things to despair about. And those of you who know about the great epic, Indian epic, Mahabharata, the last thing is a great sadness of the Mahabharata. I referred to it actually, by the way. But then there are different factors of despair and unease at the journey's end. And let me just mention one of those factors and then I'll be done. This thing is special to first-generation immigrants like me. Their particular restlessness, that they're at home nowhere. If you have read the novel named Snow by Orhan Pamuk, the great Turkish writer, in that novel, he writes about his character named Ka, a Turk living in Germany. And Ka is thinking about the 19th century Russian writer Ivan Turgenev. And I quote from that novel, Ka loved Turgenev and his elegant novels. And like the Russian writer, Ka too had tired of his own country's never-ending troubles and come to despise its backwardness, only to find himself gazing back with love and longing after he moved to Europe, unquote. This longing on the part of the deracinated in melancholy exile and yet disappointed with one's origin country is not unfamiliar to me. I also think about Sadat Manto's satirical Urdu short story, where, after the partition, India and Pakistan exchanged the inmates of each other's lunatic asylums. And one Sikh inmate from the Lahore asylum, the man from Tobatek Singh, a town now in Pakistan, he was asked to choose. This is a lunatic. He was asked to choose between India and Pakistan. His village now is in Pakistan, but Sikhs were going to India. So what he did, he decides to lie down in the no man's land between the barbed wire fences of the two countries, refusing either country. Sometimes I feel like that man from Tobatek Singh. Other times I feel like belonging to all countries. Thank you.